Good morning, everyone. Hoping that the weekend went well for all of you. We have our first, I think it's the first visitor for background picture this semester. So thank you to thank you, I'm sorry, to Jordan Beck for sending the picture of Boots. Boots, I hope I'm saying the name properly. And of course, you can have the picture of your own dog, cat, or any other favorite pet in the background of our lectures if you just send them to me. So that's one thing. One more reminder, today is Monday. I remind you that your midterm is due this Friday at midnight. So make sure that you complete that task. If you have any questions, as I said, I'm here on office hours on Tuesday and Wednesday, depending on what section you are. And of course, you can also email to me and come and talk to me. We will have a class on Friday, but that may be a little bit too late to wait to that point. But again, it's your choice. So there it is. On last week's Wednesday, we finished the discussion about political economy by focusing on specific political economy instruments. In this case, I talked about sanctions and foreign aid. The idea behind sanctions is to use those kinds of economic tools to compel change in the behavior of the action of the actor, the target. A couple of differences between sanctions and international conflict, and mostly focusing about the probability of compliance and where do countries will change their behavior based on what was called the winning coalition and types of regimes when I talked about selector theory, essentially arguing that since politicians are primarily interested in surviving in office, then the extent of support that they need in order to ensure that survival is important for their actions. So democracies, usually the winning coalition, the portion of the public that the leader needs in order to ensure winning the elections is large. So in many cases, it might be more of a problem to uh, violate and change behavior. And there's maybe actually more motivations to change behavior because the public suffers the cost of those sanctions. And we talked about different types of effects, the deprivation effects, and then the backlash effects in that context, how the public actually, instead of supporting the required change in behavior, actually says that we are disagreeing with the sanction itself. And now there's actually more support for the government in that context. That's the backlash effect. Then I talked about all those dynamics similarly in the context of foreign aid, the idea that the provision of monetary packages to any kind of recipients in exchange for policy concessions, the probability of failure, which is very high, considering the fact that in many cases it is not given with just humanitarian motivations as the main motivation. And then the problems with providing foreign aid to dictators, that again, going back to the selector theory, dictators only need to provide goods or provide some benefits to a very small number of people that's going to ensure that they will remain in office. So they just use this extra money to provide it to their supporters, then do some kind of a declarative change in policy, and essentially the public that suffers the most in those cases gets nothing out of it. So that's part of the problems with that. That's Wednesday. If you have any questions about that, as always, email me, come talk to me during office hours. We can talk about it more. So this week, we'll talk about another area which is not directly related to international conflict, but is highly important in the context of international relations overall. And this is treaties and international institutions. I will discuss the foundations for why international actors have motivation to or incentives to join cooperative agreements. Why do we have some motivations to renege on those kinds of agreements? And then we'll see how those dynamics translate to the decision by governments to participate, to take part in international institutions and international organizations, which will be more of the focus for Wednesday, but today actually serve as the entrance into that area. So let's start with some basic definitions, understanding what are international institutions and treaties, So a treaty is a formal agreement signed between two or more sovereign states. It's one of the central tools of conduct in international relations. It's also one of the oldest forms of communications among sovereign countries. Today, there's around 3,000 multilateral agreements and 27,000 bilateral treaties in effect. So this is a very, very common tools to use when it comes to interactions between countries in the international system. Some of the historical examples that you may be familiar with. So the Treaty of Westphalia, signed in 1648, serves as one of the foundations of the modern state system. Actually, the way that Europe was built at the time, the separation between different nation states, is based on the Treaty of Westphalia. The Treaty of Paris, signed in 1814, signaled the end of the Napoleonic era. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1918, you have here the first page of this treaty, is the end of the First World War, signed between the winning sides, United Kingdom, France, and Germany. The modern trade system is based on agreements such as the GATT, signed in 1948, the Marrakesh Agreement. Both of them led to the WTO, which was established in 1995, the World Trade Organizations. So a lot of those treaties were the foundations for the institutions that came afterward, and they are the ones that direct a lot of the trade systems that we have globally today. The modern security environment is shaped by the 1949 NATO treaty, which we have here, and I talked about NATO in previous lectures, and it was opposed by the Warsaw Pact, another international treaty signed by the rivals of the members of NATO. It was signed in 1955. So those are just a couple of examples. Now let's talk about some of the central elements when it comes to treaties. Treaties are important in creating legal obligation between the signing actors. But in addition, they also involve the aspect of custom, in the sense that the behavior, the complying of agreement, is derived from practice. So by engaging in those practices, we also decide to comply with them. Those kinds of agreements in many cases, or those kinds of actions are in many cases less predicated on the written law, and we have overall less instances when actors have to resort to international court in order to interpret all kinds of laws. So costume is the norm in this case is an important part of complying with international agreements. While treaties create those obligation legal instruments, they're not always binding. And there are two types in this case. One is what's called hard law. This kinds of language suggest the need or the requirement to follow the rules. Research on this topic suggests that states tend to use those kinds of a more restricting type language when they want to avoid from high transaction costs that are associated with future interactions. If I'm worried that in the future I may pay more about any kind of interaction I will have with my ally or adversary, the one that I'm signing this treaty with, we prefer to codify that language in a more strict sense into the agreement. So we're not going to pay them in the future. On the other hand, soft law, this is a language which is more suggestive and is closer to the custom aspect, which I talked about in the top of the slide. In contrast to hard law, this type of language is more likely when states face high negotiation costs. When the states that are engaged in negotiation on signing the treaty are concerned that it's going to be much harder for them to agree on what exactly are all the different provisions, then they're using a more soft language, a more abstract type of definitions. An important aspect of international treaties is the need to ratify them. Without ratification, states are not bound by the treaty. However, ratification is not a required part of the process. It's part of the process, it's not required. In addition, the rules for ratification are different in different countries. And this is a crucial factor that is central part for the research around the whole area of international treaties, because when countries introduce complex and or extended ratification procedures, it usually implies that they are dedicated for the purpose of the agreement, and of course it improves the odds of compliance. If I have to go through a very complex process to ratify this specific agreement, I'm more likely to actually comply with it. In addition, the ratification process itself is important in explaining behavior, whether it is compliance or violation. Even though by following or by focusing on the process of ratification, in a way, we're underestimating the role that norms play as part of the treaty, because sometimes we follow those treaties because of the norm of compliance, or the norm that we should cooperate and we should work with others. But the legal process, the procedure of ratification, is also important. A self-enforcing agreement is one of the most accepted types of treaties that are discussed in the context of international relations and the literature. It builds on rational choice and the idea that in the international system, there is no third party that can enforce an agreement. I talked about that, of course, when I talked about realism, neorealism, all the realist theories, and when I talked about rational choice as well, right? If the United States and Canada sign an agreement, there's no one country other than those two that can enforce the agreement between them. And how is that going to work? Again, it's based on the rational view of the actors that are part of this interaction. So in this case, if we talked about the United States and Canada, the parties will adhere to the agreement as long as each side gains more from continuing the agreement than from abrogating it. So the gains from the agreement, if we're keeping with this example of United States and Canada, the gains that the United States and Canada get from the agreement, as long as they are more than the costs, then they will keep it. It is enforced by the parties themselves because either, again, staying with our example, either Canada or the United States can decide that we're no longer interested in that specific flow of benefits, so we can change the agreement and we can enforce other kinds of conditions. Sorry. Reciprocity is one of the key enforcement mechanisms when it comes to international cooperation, overall international agreements and treaties. The logic is that compliance is a function of having both positive and negative incentive. So positive incentives is getting the benefits of cooperation over the long run. So I should cooperate. I should behave I should be engaged in reciprocity towards my ally or rival in this case, if we sign an agreement, because we both get benefits from that over the long term. In many cases, reciprocity and compliance are based actually on negative incentives, and that is fear of retaliation. That is, if I decide to renege on an agreement, then the other actor will also engage in that, and therefore setting or establishing a problematic precedent. One of the most famous ways to think about the concept of reciprocity is using the prisoner's dilemma logic. We can use this very basic game setting to understand how reciprocity is central to behavior in the international context, both for cooperation as well as for conflict. Now, overall, the prisoner's dilemma was developed in the 1950s, and it offers a very simple representation of strategic interaction between two actors. And I'm going to go over that a little bit. I want to emphasize mostly not just the idea of the potential solutions for the game or the potential outcomes for these interactions, but the role that the number of interactions between actors play in this case. So let's go into the basic setting here. The story is that two criminals are caught and they are placed in separate cells, and both of them are either offered to cooperate with the police, which in this case is what's called betrays, and that is providing some information, and the one that's going to cooperate with the police will go free, and then the other prisoner will serve 3 years in jail. And the other option for them is to stay silent, and in that case, both of them will serve 1 year. If both of them decides to, either one of them wants to cooperate with the police, they both serve also some amount of time. So those are the different options for the game. Now, the idea is to think about the potential outcomes in this kind of interactions, whether the interaction is what's called a one-shot game or a multiple iteration game. Let's start with the one-shot. Let's say that those two will only be interacting with one another once. They will only be caught once if we stay with the story. So both of the prisoners, in this case A and B, are tempted to defect, because A says, well, I'm probably not going to see B again. I will be free. He will be in jail in this kind of offer stand. So I'm better off betraying B, defecting from the interaction, and going free. However, there is a strategic nature to the game because B thinks the same thing. So what's happened in many cases is that B will defect and A will defect. And then the outcome, instead of being this, will be this. Both of them will serve some time in prison. This is a worse outcome for them than going free. it is also a worse outcome for them than just staying silent, because in that sense, both of them will serve 1 year instead of 2. So it is, that's why serving 2 years and serving 1 year, both of them are two solutions for the game from a formal representation standpoint. From a game theory standpoint, those are the two solutions for the game. This is a better solution than this one, but this is another solution. Now, if you think about that in the context of multiple interactions, so the prisoner's logic is not that fitting here, but if we think about two people that are interacting with one another and they're expected to interact for multiple times into the future, then it's both of those actors are better off cooperating and receiving the better outcome, right? This is where reciprocity is also very powerful, because the idea is that each actor in this game is basing his decisions on the choice of the other actor or the last move that the actor engaged. So that should lead us to understand that cooperation is better in the future, for the long run. I'm sorry, not just in the future. So that's the idea behind Prisoner's Dilemma. It shows how enforcement and reciprocity are two heavily linked aspects, and it can explain why trade relations are stable. We want to ensure the benefits of trade over the long run. So I'm better off staying within the agreement than defecting. Similarly, that's why we're not facing conflicts when my rival can respond in the same strength that I can. And we can think about that in the context of, in the context of mutual assured destruction, which I talked about a couple of lectures ago, the idea that both the United States had the nuclear capabilities to attack Russia and Russia had the nuclear capabilities to respond. So the United States knew that Russia can respond with a nuclear attack even after the United States will engage in an action. So that's prevented the incentive to defect from that kind of interaction. It was better off to cooperate and not attack than to defect and try to attack, because I'm going to pay costs anyway. In order to really try and tie the bow on this topic of reciprocity, I want to give another example, more of a pop culture example for the idea of Prisoner's Dilemma. And for that, just a second, I'm sorry about that. Let's get back to, this is a short clip from, oh, there it is. Now you see that. From the movie The Dark Knight. This is the ferry boat clip, and this is a very nice representation of Prisoner's Dilemma. So let's just watch this. I'm just going to see part of it, about a little bit over a minute, and then I'll do some small talking about that afterwards. So let's listen. Let me just make sure that the volume is up. There it is.
Oh my God. Looks like some kind of detonator. Why would they give us the detonator to our own bomb?
Tonight, you're all going to be a part of a social experiment. I'm ready right now to blow you all sky high.
Liberty come in, over. He's dead.
Anyone attempts to get off their boat, you all die. Each of you has a remote to blow up the other boat. At midnight, I blow you all up. If, however, one of you presses the button, I'll let that boat live. So, who's it gonna be? Harvey Dent's most wanted scumbag collection, or the sweet and innocent civilians? You choose. Oh, and you might want to decide quickly, because the people on the other boat may not be quite so noble.
Okay, so it's just a cutoff from the original movie. Let's just go back to our slides. But this clip nicely represents the idea behind that, because as you remember, one of the things that the basic setting of the game theory of the Prisoner's Dilemma is that the prisoners sit in separate cells, they cannot talk to one another. And they show very nicely here how the boats cannot communicate with one another because the bad guys, in this case, disable the communication. So they cannot talk amongst one another, right? And in order to, the simple solution for that, of course, is just like in Prisoner's Dilemma, the two boats in this case can cooperate by not blowing the other, and then both of them will survive. But the bad guy in this case, the Joker, the character of the Joker in this case, overcomes that problem by saying that, well, if both of you are not going to make a decision by, I don't remember, the time was midnight, I'm going to blow both of you. So he tries to mitigate this cooperation solution. And of course, the movie keeps developing from there to find other elements in this case. But I really wanted to give you this. You can look online for even more detailed discussions about that. But this is a very nice way to think about and to understand the logic behind the strategic nature of the prisoner's dilemma, what it shows us in terms of the strategic nature of the interactions between two actors, and how that is going to affect also the idea of the fact that one boat will not blow up the other. And there's a part of them that says, I don't remember in which one of the two sides they talk about that, but they say we should not wait any longer because they're going to blow us up. And then one of the character responds, we're still here. So there's still an the idea here of reciprocity. They haven't done it either yet. So if we will respond in kind, maybe both of us will survive. All right. Let's keep going. Self-enforcing treaties relate to international law through credible commitment theory, a potential problem for ensuring compliance over time, and making sure also that both of the actors that sign the agreement can enjoy the benefits, is the risk or the incentives for reneging in the future. And I talked about that when I talked about both of rational choice, when we talked about the credible commitment problem that Fearon talked about. If I have incentives to renege on an agreement in the future, there's a problem for the potential of how likely is my cooperation with my ally, rival, whatever that is, going to last into the future. And in that sense, an international agreement, one of the objectives behind them is to reduce those kinds of incentives by creating conditions for cooperation over the long run. And how is that? Agreements ensure compliance by requiring the participants in the agreements to pay clear, non-trivial costs in order to be part of it. And that also provides strengthen the credibility of the agreement. That includes both ex ante costs, which are sunk costs paid upfront. It offers a signal of credibility. If I'm paying high cost upfront, I'm more likely to also comply with the agreement, whatever agreement I came to with the other actor. And it also includes ex post costs, which are paid if a violation takes place. That is going through mechanisms such as arbitration, prosecution. All of this are codified into the agreement, and they increase the probabilities that the two actors that sign the agreement are going to be less concerned about the other defecting, because if I'm going to defect, I'll be faced arbitration, prosecution, whatever mechanism that may be, I'm going to pay a cost. So that increases the idea that I'm more likely to comply with the agreement. Another relevant aspect in this case is reputation. Compliance is a function of securing reputation. I'm complying because I want to ensure that I have some reputation that I can be trusted with, and then I can work with others. In order to make a treaty credible, the reputational cost must be accepted by all members of society. So it has to be actual cost. And in that case, that means that following the laws should be a top priority within the society behind the actor that signs the agreement, because then violating the agreement becomes a problem. Now, this is the theoretical logic behind it. And one question that the research has addressed in this case, is that really the case? Do the citizens actually care about reputation for violations, yes or not? So using all kinds of experimental methods and surveys, scholars assess that mechanism. Do actions that violate international law actually affect the perception of the violating actor? And the evidence overall is supportive, in that sense that respondents reject violating behavior. At the same time, we should take those kinds of results and treat them more carefully. First, because generalizing from specific surveys, as I've talked about, should be done cautiously. But also, we have to think about the context in this case. For example, electoral conditions or electoral setting can really affect that. I may think completely different about violating or complying with agreement based on whether elections are in play, whether the leaders that made those kinds of actions or those kinds of decisions are from the party that I support or not. So we should be careful about that. Reputation, and thinking about reputation and measuring reputation and assessing its effect, is also a problem in situations when it's hard to observe the actions of the others. If I don't know how the other actor behaves, it's harder for me to assess the reputation in that case. Also, when future interactions are not valued. If I don't care about future interactions I'm going to have with my ally or adversary, then I don't care about my reputation, right? Now, this idea that reputation plays a role here is also part of the role that domestic audiences play in the context of complying with the treaty. In many cases, compliance may be dependent on internal dynamics and the desire of politicians to appeal their supporters. So there may be one situation where that in sense of understanding how does the domestic public has an effect on whether leaders will comply with an agreement or not. So there's one option where leaders will be focusing on appeasing domestic audience, which does not necessarily accept this treaty, so they will reject the treaty. They will violate the treaty because the public does not accept that, right? Another possibility is the other way around. The public actually accept those kinds of behavior, and the public may be a little bit concerned about how the government will behave. So in that case, compliance is actually may be enhanced because the treaty itself provides new information to the public regarding how the government is going to behave. And this kind of dynamic is more prevalent when the constituency, the members of the public that supports the leaders, are in highly, first of all, it's relatively a large constituency, and when they're highly supportive of complying with the agreement. So reading about those kinds of treaties provides to the public, new information on the government's record of compliance, and that reduces the amount of incentives that the government has to violate the agreement and suffer electoral cost. So that means overall, what that means is that provides us with some kind of understanding of why liberal democracies are often better in compliance. Those kinds of regimes usually have large constituencies, and for the vast majority, those kinds of citizens support international cooperation and stability. So that means the government has less incentives to violate the agreement. That in terms of the effect of the public and how that affects regime types and complying with international agreement. We can also think about the effect that the treaty has on the level of support within the public and how that translates to the behavior of the government, to the pressure that the public can have on the government. A study from 2009 argued that in some topic areas, international treaties can encourage local groups to mobilize and demand attention to comply with those kinds of treaties that are mostly related to all types of rights. If it's possible to move this into a ratification process, it makes the issue even more legitimate. The issue itself becomes a lot more legitimate. It can also help by attracting media attention, recruit allies within the country, or even external allies in this case, and overall increase the legitimacy of the issue. And this is more prevalent in terms of human rights treaties, in terms of civil rights, human rights, women's rights, children's rights. In this case, the effect of the treaty is a lot more powerful when the stakeholders of the issue have both the opportunity and the motivation to organize and demand compliance. So when international treaty in this case is highly accepted by some groups within society, that may lead to higher integrating the ideas behind that, and that can increase the compliance. But at the same time, the regime type matters for this process because in stable autocracies, citizens have no means to mobilize. Maybe citizens really care about those kinds of issues and they want to promote them, but they cannot mobilize and pressure the government. In stable democracies, many citizens care about that, but they don't really have the motivation to go into a whole collective action to pressure the government to accept those kinds of rules. So this function of the treaty as affecting public recruitment and motivation and then action against the government is more likely to be exploited for certain civil rights issues and is more likely to be prevalent in what's called partial and transitioning democracies. So those countries are just going into the process of becoming democracies. Mobilization becomes a more relevant topic or relevant action that is being taken. And the people really care about that because this is their own civil rights. In democracies, we already have a certain amount of rights. We not necessarily have the motivation to engage with it even more. And all that, when we think about the effect of the treaty on the way that the public behaves and then the government, or the other way around, the public, how that behaves and how that leads to the acceptance of treaties, relates to the crucial theoretical aspect that's called endogeneity, or the direction of the causality. In this case, the question we are trying to understand is, do domestic conditions lead to the adoption or seeking of such agreements? Is it coming from the public itself, or is it the other way around, that this international agreement creates that kind of incentives within the public? If international conduct is based on the treaties, it is possible that some internal conditions made the treaty more appealing, and that is a better explanation for the behavior, for the adoption of those kinds of agreements, than just following the more protocols of ratifications or signing. So that's part of this. This is just some of the more theoretical questions that researchers in that areas are engaged with. All right, so let's shift away a little bit from the theoretical aspect of it and look at more specific issues where treaties are signed and how some of those theoretical mechanisms work. So I want to start first with international environmental regulation. In this research, a lot of the research argues that transparency plays an important and critical role in ensuring compliance. And a lot of the scholars focus on the design of the treaties themselves as shaping the incentive structure for the different actors and how likely they are to violate the agreement, in that sense, mostly pollute the environment or whatever the negative outcomes are. So some of the details that those kinds of treaties must include is the capacity of the government to implement those kinds of complex regulations, especially in the context of environmental regulations, the ways that the government can constrain private actors from violating, and what types of positive and negative inducements are introduced or used to ensure such compliance. Some of the main actors that are involved in the creation of such agreements and also must adhere to their details so that they have to comply for them are private actors. This is not just between governments. That may involve also private firms, private members of the private sector. And that presents a problem because the incentives for violations for those kinds of actors are much more severe because of the simple mechanism of market competition. For private firms, compliance with international agreements, which includes a lot of those different regulations, involves a large early cost, and that presents a problem. As an example, I want to talk about the Deepwater Horizon explosion. It took place in April 2010, an explosion on this giant rig somewhere off the coast of Louisiana. Of course, in the Gulf of Mexico, estimated oil spill of about 4.9 million barrels of oil. The U.S. government has formed a formal investigation, and they found that British Petroleum, BP, which was the owner of the rig, as well as the rig operator, are the prime responsibles for that because of lacking security procedures, which were motivated in many cases by cost reduction. So again, the idea behind trying to be more efficient and reduce the cost that private firms are mostly following it, make it much harder for them to comply with complex agreement. But at the same time, the US government reports also found that there were systematic failures in the government regulations themselves, as well as the industry standards. That shows the complexity of that idea of building those kinds of treaties and then ensuring compliance by them when we are engaged in not just two countries, but a country which builds different types of public regulations, and then a private actor that has to abide by them. The damages from that disasters were significant, severe natural effect, of course, across the entire Gulf. Some have reported damages as far as Florida or even the coast of Texas. There was significant harm to wildlife that persisted for many years after that event. So we can think about some of the terrible events that can take place because of those kinds of problematic regulations, but still the difficulties to actually build those kinds of treaties. So what can maybe help to mitigate some of the negative incentives to violate agreements? One of them is the actions by public actors such as labor unions or local ports when it comes to areas related to environment and the ocean. They can compel violent actors to reduce their negative behavior by different procedures that they put in place. The private actor cannot operate from a certain set of ports, so it has to abide for some rules. Also, an important role is being played by NGOs, non-governmental organizations, as well as members of the civil society. They are crucial to effecting compliance. research in that area has shown that greater participation by those kinds of actors, as well as implementing practices such as corporate interest mediation, increase the extent of compliance by private actors in ensuring the keeping with environmental regulations. Overall, what this research showed us is that participation by non-business civil society groups can have a strong positive influence on compliance with multilateral environmental agreements. So again, it's a very complicated area, but it's still very, very, also very important one. Another area I want to talk about is human rights treaties. This one is distinct from a lot of other areas of research and areas of signing international agreements. For once, it is less likely to draw the attention of other actors in terms of importance. So that is, the citizens of the United States care less about how the citizens in countries such as, I don't know, South Africa are being treated. So if the agreement between the United States, if signing the human rights agreement for the United States and for South Africa, it really matters less to me how they are being treated. I care a lot more how government treats me, right? Reciprocity, which, as I said, is one of the most important aspects of those kinds of mechanism, is not part of the equation here. It's not a main issue. And it's harmed the design of treaties which will be self-enforcing. Because if both the United States and South Africa, if we stay with our example, sign this kind of a treaty, and then the government misbehaves against here in the United States, it doesn't mean that South Africa has to respond somehow against the United States and the other way around. If the South Africa government abuses the rights of the citizens, it does not mean that we have to respond in kind. We may, but it's not the main part. And the third is that those kinds of agreements involve mostly non-material issues, such as human rights, human respect, dignity, and that requires that the agreements themselves will have a strong theoretical foundation. It's going to highlight normative acceptance before even going to the practical aspect of it. Now, in terms of actually trying to comply with those, one approach focuses on persuasion and discussion to change ideas about what constitutes appropriate behavior. Once those issues based on this kinds of promotion and persuasion become salient, they can be internalized into national laws and raise the standards for the norm of human rights within a country. And that makes the official process of ratification even more important because it compels the government to justify their actions whenever they violate that. And it makes it a lot more, makes it a lot more of a legitimate aspect. But the main problem when it comes to human rights treaties, everybody can sign them. The main problem, of course, is enforcement. And that's what the example I want to talk about here. And that's in the context of repressive regimes that signed all kinds of relevant treaties. For example, here we're about the ratification of the CAT agreement, which is the Convention Against Torture. So research in that context suggests that when repressive regimes sign those kinds of treaties, their main motivations is to co-opt the competition, which means they want to show some degree of political competition within the country. So they ratify those kinds of agreements, such as the CAT treaty, as a concession. We're going to ratify the agreements against torture, and then you will be viewed as having some kind of political competition, so we're not oppressing the public or oppressing the political process. However, because there is no clear international enforcement mechanism, the ratification process is only expressive. So we can't really enforce those countries that sign those kinds of treaties and then ratify them to actually abide by the different provisions within the treaties. The evidence in the research in that, the evidence showed that there was no particular differences between oppressive regimes that ratified this specific CAT treaty and those that did not ratify that regarding how much they used torture. So again, the treaty itself had no effect in this case. That's the problem with it, and that's the problem of enforcement. The last area I want to talk about for today, which will be our introduction into the lecture on Wednesday, is the area of national security. And the most prevalent aspect of international treaties is alliances and defense pacts. Overall, international legal agreements in this context are crucial for the interactions between states. and that involves interactions such as war, as well as interactions such as peace and security overall. The most famous types, as I said, are alliances, defense pacts, peace agreements, territorial boundaries. All of them are typically governed by treaties, as well as the laws of war fighting. So the way that we conduct wars, the way that we behave during a war, is codified within some treaties. Thinking about those kinds of agreements from a rational standpoint, again, the difficulties of compliance are mostly residing with the mechanism of credible commitment. We can sign an alliance or we can sign a peace treaty with some other rival, but if things change, maybe we have incentives to renege and not keep the commitment. Another example, which we'll talk about a lot more in detail on Wednesday, is alliances. The idea behind such treaties is that if I signed a treaty of an alliance with some other country, I will intervene militarily under certain conditions if conflict erupts. Overall, the data suggests that primarily alliances are kept, and the main motivations for that are concerns about or the desire to secure my own reputation. But still, there are some conditions that lead to violations. First is a significant change in the relative power of the actor. If I sign an alliance with someone and then that actor is substantially weaker now, maybe I have incentives to actually not do that anymore. I don't want to send so many military forces if that actor is that weak now, or the other way around. A significant change in the domestic institutions, if it was a democracy and for some reason it deteriorated away for a non-democracy, or the other way around, maybe that's going to change. So sometimes that may lead to violations of such treaties. And when a new outside alliance is formed, it's also a potential incentive to renege on those kinds of agreements. Before I talk about the last example for those kinds of treaties for today, I want to stop for today's attendance word. The word for today is the word start. Start is the attendance word for today. So the last example I'm going to talk about is related to treaties which talk about the laws of war. How do we conduct war? What are some things that we are allowed to do during war? What are things that we are not allowed to do during wars? And one of the main questions that scholars have addressed is if states comply with these rules when they are engaged in conflict, and whether ratifying related agreements affects their actions. So the main question is, do armies intentionally kill civilians, even though the countries that send those armies accepted within the international treaty that they signed the laws that forbid targeting civilians? So this is the research by Valentino, as you have here on the screen, and they coded conflicts during the 20th century and whether the participants in the conflict have ratified the relevant treaties, which included the 1899 Hague Convention, the 1907 Hague Convention, the 1949 Geneva Convention, and the Geneva Convention Protocols of 1977. All of them related also to the conduct towards what's called POWs, prisoners of war, but also about not targeting civilians within a war, within a conflict. What they find in their research is that the intentional killing of civilians is correlated with the strategy chosen to prosecute the war, but is not at all influenced by the ratification of the relevant treaty. So if I'm, as a country, targeting civilians during the war, it has nothing to do with the legal aspect that I signed and then ratified the Hague Convention of 1977. It has anything to do with the strategic incentives I'm facing now, because I have to take control of this area, of this village, of this city, whatever that may be. And that means, of course, that despite those international treaties that exist and countries sign them and ratify them, civilians still remain in very high risk when it comes to war. At the same time, we can think about another implication of that, and where the legal norm plays a role in the conduct of war, and that's the potential for indirect effect, which works through the selection of a strategy in a conflict. For example, if states that ratify those kinds of agreements are less willing to engage in strategies such as laying a siege on an enemy or causing a starvation for the population, then that may suggest that the legal norms of the way we should treat civilians in conflict may be underlying some of the strategic choices that those actors are taking as rational actors. So I'm deciding not to engage in a siege on an enemy city. That's the strategy I chose, and that's the rational strategy for me based on the strategic calculus that I'm facing. But some of the underlying factors behind that is the fact that it is a norm in my country not to attack civilians or non-combatants, and that's part of ratifying the agreement that we went through. So the idea behind that is that the norm serve as an implicit origin of the strategy. It does not have a direct effect as the international agreement may have intended, but it still matters for the outcomes, which for our sake is not targeting civilians in war, right? So this is some of the basic theoretical foundations of this area. It's very complicated. It requires a lot of research to address a different aspect. And on Wednesday, we keep talking about a little bit more. If you want to read more, of course, then this is just a couple of options that you can go to. And with that, I am finishing today, reminding you once again, Friday is the deadline for midterms. Come and talk to me if you have questions. We have office hours starting from tomorrow already for one section and Wednesday for the other section. And with that, I will see you on Wednesday. Bye, everyone.